You are listening to Viewpoints from PlaceCloud. Cultural researchers tell stories of places from around the world. For the full multimedia experience and to support the creators you enjoy, visit placecloud.io.
Pentonville was a major experiment in prison design and discipline in the Victorian era. It opened in 1842 as a model prison. Its experimental system of discipline and radial design was copied across Britain and the world. Inmates are still serving time in HMP Pentonville, which hasn't changed much physically since it was first built. Yet, in 2015, MP Michael Gove described it as the most dramatic example of failure in the British prison system. In fact, Pentonville Prison went from model prison to dramatic failure quite quickly in the 19th century. When Pentonville Prison opened in 1842, it was the apex of Victorian modernity, even if it's now become a familiar type of prison architecture. Enclosed by large walls, portcullises, and ringed with guard towers, the prison itself was made up of 4 wings, which radiated from a central clock tower like fronds in a fan. There were multiple exercise yards which were also segmented by walls like spokes of a wheel. So individual prisoners could exercise separately in triangular yards. Pentonville's design was so influential that 54 more prisons were built to its design over the next 6 years. Each ward had 3 stories of cells to hold around 400 prisoners. Guards passed along corridors in front of the cells and could inspect prisoners through peepholes. The cells were only 4 metres by 2 metres across and 2 metres and 3/4 high. They were specially constructed to prevent sound from passing through. If an inmate needed to communicate with a guard, they could ring a bell which would go off in the corridor. A gong sounded to signal to prisoners when to wake up, work, eat and sleep. Labour took place from 6:30 in the morning until 7 p.m, and at night prisoners could read from religious books. All of this continued in complete silence. Outside each cell there was a letter and number denoting the cell's placement along the corridor, for example A2 or B1. The prisoner was referred to in this way instead of by their name, which was a very dehumanizing process. Pentonville's system of discipline was modelled on the silent system, which was trialled by Quakers at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia for a little over a decade. The idea was that by keeping prisoners in solitary isolation, unable to see or speak to one another, they would be given the time to repent and commune with God. The architect John Haviland had been inspired by Jeremy Bentham's plans for the Panopticon and designed Eastern State with a central tower to inspect the inmates at all times. International visitors flocked to see Eastern State Penitentiary. William Crawford, the founding member of the Society for the Improvement of Prison Discipline, was commissioned by the British government to visit America and report back. Crawford was impressed, describing how, quote, solitude inspires permanent terror, which subdues but does not debase, end quote. The complete isolation from other inmates induced what he called habitual submission. Crawford advocated to Parliament that Pentonville be run along similar lines. In contrast, when author Charles Dickens visited, he described the slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. His fears would prove to dog Pentonville Prison over the next few years. The British government believed that 18 months of solitary confinement in Pentonville would best suit men sentenced to transportation overseas. Home Secretary Sir James Graham described it as a portal to the penal colony. The idea was that men would let go of their past, including the criminal associations in their local neighbourhoods, and would use the time in prison to repent their past crimes. This would clear their minds as they turned their thoughts to a life of labour in another hemisphere. This moral reformation was assisted by daily sermons in a chapel. The chapel was designed to prevent inmates from speaking. Prisoners were moved through the prison in caps with peaks pulled down, preventing them from seeing one another. As they passed along the pews in number order, they closed a wooden partition behind them to separate them from their neighbour. When it came time to leave, a wheel up front indicated which prisoner should exit when. Guards stood on elevated viewing platforms during the sermon to watch over the prisoners and check they weren't communicating clandestinely. Still, convicts got very good at speaking to one another over cover of singing or passing secret messages under the wooden partitions. They also tapped messages in their cells using a kind of Morse code. A year and a half of extreme isolation turned many of the prisoners slowly insane. The mental toll was evident in high rates of depression, mania, hallucinations, often religious, and suicides that were committed by prisoners in states of despair. When prisoners from Pentonville first boarded the bustling convict vessels to be transported to Australia, they often experienced fits. In 1845, the Surgeon General of the convict ship Stratheden reported that all the Pentonville men, and none of those from Millbank or Parkhurst, appeared, quote, very much alarmed and broke out into fits within 48 hours of arrival on board. To treat them, the surgeon laid them on their backs, and their faces were well rubbed with a wet towel. Reverend Kingsmill, the chaplain at Pentonville, insisted that convicts sent to Australian colonies flourished, claiming to have received letters from former convicts about their successes. Others commented that prisoners sent to Australia from Pentonville were particularly quiet and orderly, and that the fits on board were feigned for attention. Publicly, the Pentonville authorities refused to acknowledge the high rates of insanity, choosing instead to hide the number of cases of mental disturbance and continuing to incarcerate and transport men who were mentally ill. Only the most severely unwell were removed to Bethlehem Asylum or the Invalid Hulks. The Pentonville commissioners began hand-picking convicts to ensure that they were physically and mentally healthy enough to withstand long-term solitary confinement. If these inmates still went on to become distressed, the commissioners started tracing their family history to explain away their mental illness as an existing defect. To those prisoners who began to show signs of mental distress or depression, they prescribed a more varied diet and outdoors labour. After the sudden deaths of Pentonville's commissioners and advocates of the silent system, Reverend William Russell and William Crawford, in 1847, the new prison authorities reduced the severity of the system. They reduced the length of time in solitary confinement down from 18 months to 15 months in 1848 and 9 months in 1853. The year previously, 1852, only 5 cases of insanity were listed in the annual report, though a further 7 had been removed from Pentonville on, quote, mental grounds. Towards the end of their time at Pentonville, prisoners began to be slowly introduced to people through working in association. This time in workshops was also meant to prepare the prisoners for their new life in Australia. They learned how to cobble shoes, make mats, and sew basic garments, which were used within the convict establishment. Their skills were rough and ready, as a few months of training was nothing compared to the years it took to properly apprentice in tailoring, mat making, or cobbling. It was supposed to help convicts earn a living in Australia, but these skills weren't in demand, where agricultural labour was instead sorely needed. From 1850, prisoners were no longer transported, but sent from Pentonville to the public works at Portland, Woolwich, or Portsmouth instead. Established as a model prison, Pentonville ultimately proved a failure, both as a system of reformation and as preparation for transportation overseas.